Well, let's go live to Yerevan on the programme and speak to Richard Giragosian. He is the director of the Regional Studies Centre think tank in the Armenian capital. Hello to you and thanks for speaking to us here on the programme. First of all, on this question of possible Russian interference, what is Russia accused of and what's the evidence?
Well, what we see is a campaign from Russia in terms of interference in the domestic parliamentary election in Armenia. However, the disinformation, the so-called fake news, is neither a surprise nor is it particularly effective. And in many ways, we do see Armenian voters expressing their own opinions regardless of the disinformation that is coming from Moscow.
You say this disinformation campaign is not particularly effective from Moscow. Tell us then a little bit about some of the big campaigning issues. Perhaps let's talk first of all about Nagorno-Karabakh, the war there fought in 2023 between Armenia and Azerbaijan came to an end, yes, in 2023. How big of an issue is that today on the minds of voters?
Well, despite the geopolitical context, this election is also much more about a continuation of policies of normalizing relations with neighbors. Also, in terms of the government's ability to accommodate to a difficult, painful post-war reality without Nagorno-Karabakh. But what's most notable, Nadia, is nationalism no longer resonates. This is less about foreign policy and national security and much more an expected mandate for a government to continue in terms of seeking peace over any kind of renewed hostilities.
That said, though, according to some of the polling I've seen, Pashinyan himself, the Prime Minister, his support has fallen. In 2021, it was something like 54% of the population. Now it's just 30%. How do you account for his drop in popularity?
I see it as somewhat normal and natural, to be quite honest. There is, in effect, a honeymoon period since he came to power in 2018, riding a rather populist wave. But the electorate in Armenia has become a little more pragmatic, much more practical. However, the advantage of the government and the reason it will likely be reelected is less about government support and more about the lack of any credible, viable alternative to the government. In other words, the opposition remains fragmented, unpopular, discredited, largely pro-Russian, but is really losing votes in this election. And unfortunately, we do see the absence of any kind of opposition as essentially a vulnerability for Armenian democracy going forward.
Look, in your analysis, Pashinyan's party is expected to do well in this election. Assuming that that is true and those pro-Russian figures lose, what kind of impact do you think there will be on relations with Russia? Because Russia is Armenia's biggest trading partner. Could we see repercussions there?
Well, we already do see a pre-existing crisis in relations with Russia. We also see a degree of pressure on the government, but what's most notable is the absence of other factors. In other words, there is no Russian direct support of any real significance for the opposition. It's more to increase pressure on the incumbent government. And at the same time, the real bellwether test that shows we're not yet in a full-blown crisis is the price of natural gas. In other words, when Russia demands to renegotiate the subsidized price of gas to Armenia, that is the indication that we've gone too far too fast. But I also expect the Armenian government counterintuitively, if reelected, to reassure Moscow that Armenia is committed to remaining within the Eurasian Economic Union and not necessarily confronting Russia directly. And finally, the Armenian government's transactional strategy with Russia is a bit passive-aggressive, but careful not to provoke an overreaction.
All right, good to get your analysis. Thank you so much, Richard Giragosian, talking to us there live from Yerevan.